See, the passage that we're going to be reading about very soon, from Daniel chapter 3, has a lot to do with the dynamics of power, and there's a couple bullies, there's some bullies in this passage too. But these are at a very high level, and in that fact they're at the highest levels of power in their world of their day. Now, there are power struggles going on in different levels in this passage. First of all, King Nebuchadnezzar is trying to take power away from God that belongs to him. But also on the lower level, there's a power struggle between some of the king's other jealous advisors and then Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, who are followers of God. So maybe you'll be able to notice those things as we read through this passage from Daniel chapter 3. It's a story, right? In Daniel, these first 6 chapters are all stories, so I guess read along or sit back and listen as we read through this chapter 3 and the story of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So, the satraps, and all the other provincial officials. And they stood before him. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing or the fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers, or actually the word there is Chaldeans, basically means the native Babylonians, and especially the native Babylonians who were kind of involved in their religion. They came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of all these instruments must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs in the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace 7 times louder than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed, their robe not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. And Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. I forgot my coffee, so this is going to be a marathon here, if I can read through all this in this wind. Well, let's start actually by taking a closer look at this chapter. It's another one of these Daniel stories that just has so much packed into it. Verses 1 through 7 give us all these details that play into a very typical, actually a Babylonian or Persian setting. There's the plain of Dura, which archaeologists have found references to, along with references to gold-plated statues and of gatherings of great numbers of officials and different types of musical instruments, and even examples of criminals being executed by being thrown into ovens. So the event that's described here is really not out of character with things that did happen in that time and place. But in this chapter we see, what we really see, when you step back and look at what's actually going on here, is something that looks remarkably like Nebuchadnezzar trying to either undo or probably even redo the Tower of Babel from Genesis chapter 11. And it's in roughly the same place. Oh, you're wonderful. Thank you so much. That's right. Thank you. And by the way, thanks for Brian reminded me. But just to remind you, we're going to do the congregational prayer after the message as well as that song at this point. Okay, back to Nebuchadnezzar. What he's trying to do is really undo or redo what happened at the Tower of Babel, and it's in the same place actually where the Tower of Babel was built, or fairly close to it. So here, instead of a tower though, there's this enormous 60 cubit, or really 90-foot tall statue made of gold, which, if you're of a mind to such things, back of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was the Colossus of Rhodes, which was only just a little bit taller than this actually. So this is an incredible piece of achievement, and it's designed to draw people's attention to what Nebuchadnezzar and his empire can do. And then there's this repeated list of all the different types of officials of their day, but they're from all around the empire. They're representing all of the people that are part of this Babylonian empire. And then there's a repeated list of these musical instruments, but those two are musical instruments taken from all over the Babylonian empire too, looking like it's trying to combine them basically back into harmony, taking all of these different voices of music and combining them back into one voice of harmony, with a call to worship this one statue as a testimony to the greatness of King Nebuchadnezzar. From the words that are used, I guess, and how they're used, we get the impression that this statue is either a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself or of the primary Babylonian god Nebu, from whom Nebuchadnezzar gets the first part of his name. And throughout this chapter, though, we also get this really unholy mixture of religion and king and nation and a call to worship really what applies to all three at once. And for that matter, where do you think Nebuchadnezzar got the gold to build this statue? We read back in 1 Chronicles 29 that King David alone, just him, gave personally 3,000 talents, or the equivalent of 110 tons of gold, for the building of the temple in Jerusalem, which Nebuchadnezzar had sacked. And then there's this call for all the leaders across the Babylonian Empire to gather by Babel, hearing the music of all the nations, and to fall down and worship this statue of Nebuchadnezzar, his namesake God. It would have been obviously the most impressive gathering and statue that any of the Israelites had ever seen. The full power and greatness of humanity's greatest leader of that day was on full display here. And right there in that setting, think about the pressure that Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego would have been under to conform and to go along with the crowd. But there's a big problem for them. Obviously, bowing down and worshiping that idol would have been doing exactly the same thing that put their nation of Israel, of Judah, into exile in the first place. Idolatry, or even just mixing in the worship of other gods with the worship of the true God, was one of the three main reasons that Judah and Israel had been either destroyed or exiled. For Bible trivia, you can look up what the other two main reasons were. There was three main reasons. One of them was simply that they were mixing in this worship of the gods around them into the worship of God. So for Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, as the highest ranking Jewish officials present, as the representatives of their people, of the people of God, the question becomes, had they learned what they needed to learn as God's people? Here's this line in the sand, and under extreme intimidation or bullying and penalty of death, would they stand their ground and worship only the true God? Or would they cross that line and bow down? Will they cave in and become just like the rest of the world around them? Because nobody else isn't bowing down to the God of that age. So where ultimately will they put their trust? Here at this attempted repeat of Babel? In humanity that Babel represents, or in the true God? Well, we see the plot thicken in verses 8 through 12. And these power dynamics kind of come in as some government officials bring some charges to Nebuchadnezzar. But if you remember from the last chapter, from the end of chapter 2, these officials who would have been bringing these charges against Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, they're the ones who Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego had just been promoted over top of. And so it appears that there was probably some real professional jealousy playing out because of those promotions. And these officials think that they have found a power play to get rid of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. And there's even some racism implied here by the contrast of these accusing officials being called Chaldeans or native Babylonians rather than just astrologers in the word there. The word there is really for native Babylonians in verse 8, along with the characterization of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego as Jews being emphasized both here and in verse 12. So their motives seem to be very self-serving. And they know exactly how to manipulate King Nebuchadnezzar, don't they? I mean, in Nebuchadnezzar's response in verses 13 to 15, we see exactly what the issue really is for him. Has he forgotten his acknowledgement of Daniel's dream revealing and future controlling God from chapter 2? When Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego defy his order, he is enraged at their challenge to his authority. And in his fury, he finally shouts out with all of the insolence that humanity can muster, "And who is the God that will deliver you from my hand?" This is direct confrontation with God. The God of David, the God of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego. He's probably used some of that gold from God's temple to build this statue. And then a direct challenge to the first and second of the Ten Commandments, to have no other gods before the God of Israel, and not to make any other object for the purpose of worshiping it, Nebuchadnezzar makes it clear that what he's saying is really he wants no other gods before him. But when faced with that challenge, as clear as it could possibly be, Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego express exactly the faith that God has asked of them. They hold their ground, they name this form of bullying really for what it is, and they even acknowledge that God may not choose to save them from the fire, and even if he doesn't, they will still ultimately, they'll put their faith in him and obey him rather than cross that line and worship Nebuchadnezzar's idol. And now what's Nebuchadnezzar's response? He's outraged. He is furious. He does everything he can possibly do to exert his control, his power over the situation, to show his power in the face of a challenge. And he orders some of the mightiest men of his army, the biggest, baddest he-men he can control, and orders them to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then he orders the furnace heated 7 times hotter than it usually heated. Now, we know from archaeology that the Babylonian kilns like this were typically heated to about 1,600 to 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit. And the words used here are really kind of a familiar Babylonian hyperbole, meaning that basically he's just having that fire heated as hot as it can possibly be heated. So hot that even his strongest men are killed just getting close enough to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in. But it's still no use. And so in this classic showdown, Nebuchadnezzar's grand show of the greatest extent of his power completely backfires on him. For the absolute best that he can do does absolutely nothing to God's men except that the fire frees them by burning the ropes off them. There's no other hint even of Nebuchadnezzar's great power play, not even a whiff of smoke survives as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go strolling about along with the presence of God there with them. And God dismisses this greatest show of humanity's power as if there's nothing to it. And he does it by fulfilling one of his oft-repeated promises of the Old Testament that we read earlier, I will be with you. And he delivers them not just from the flames, but through the flames. The very best that mankind can do only serves to give a great example of the power of God. And God does it in front of all of these officials, from every level, from every stretch, every part of his empire, that he had summoned there to display his greatness, and instead God uses it to put this on this great example of his power, so that there is no doubt in anybody's mind there how great God really is. And all Nebuchadnezzar can do is to worship God and want others to worship him. And then he does the exact opposite of what those Chaldean accusers were hoping for. Instead of this being the downfall of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what happens to them? They get promoted even higher. So how do we respond to this? How do we look at this chapter then for where we're at? This day, this place, this time. You know, the truth is that there will always be those who want to take believers' devotion away from God. That is Satan's ultimate goal, after all. And he will do whatever he can do to make that happen. But there are a couple important things, though, that we can take away from this passage related to that. The first is to be aware of the danger of putting any nation or political leader in the place of God. Theologian Martin Buber once wrote, "Every nation is inclined to make an idol of their own inner spirit. Israel's calling was to erect a throne to God rather than to itself. And that is why every nation is bound to desire to get rid of us at the time it is setting itself up as the absolute." In our passage, that's very clearly what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do. He wants people to worship this statue representing him and his empire, and he will kill anybody who doesn't do it. And honestly, we don't really have to go very far back in history at all to see examples of this same thing. Just in the last 100 years, this is exactly what Hitler did with Nazi Germany, raising the nation with him as its leader to the object of people's ultimate concerns, basically to be more important than God. And he clearly tried to kill off anybody who opposed that. Stalin did the same thing with communist Russia. Mao did the same thing with communist China. It's one of the characteristics that has played out in Marxist communism when put into practice has been to raise the nation to the level of importance and to try and eliminate Christianity and other religions. And in both of those examples of Stalin and Mao, they killed off tens of millions of their own people for what they called the cause of the greater good, for the communist state to reach its goals. But in more subtle ways, we can also see this today in politicians who try to blend in the worship of God with the worship of country. I've never seen a more obvious example of this than a couple weeks ago, when our current vice president was quoting a passage from the Bible, from Hebrews chapter 12. He said, "Let us run with perseverance the race set before us, and let us fix our eyes on," and then he stopped. And instead of saying Jesus, like the passage says, he inserted the words "Old Glory," referring to the American flag. I believe that Mike Pence is a Christian, but that was a mistake. We have to be careful of those kinds of things. And of course, it's not just him. The president before him said that America was the greatest hope for humanity. And pretty much every president that I can remember, and that goes all the way back to Nixon, has said something very similar to that at one point or another. Christians need to be very careful about those kinds of statements. It would seem, honestly, that both parties are willing to hold up the government in the place of God if it suits their agenda. Not everybody in it, not every politician by any means, but there are times when that can happen, and we have to be careful of that, especially in election years. For those who are marginally religious, honestly, it's a very easy trap to fall into. Yes, you know what? We can love our country, even with its imperfections. But as Christians, we need to be careful to not put our allegiance to it above our allegiance to God. That's the same thing that Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego were faced with. We are first of all citizens of God's kingdom, and His is the kingdom that will last forever, long after any earthly kingdom, as we saw last week. And the first two of the Ten Commandments, to worship, to have no other gods before God, and to create nothing else that we will worship in His place, those still apply to us. And even if it's not, honestly, even if it's not the nation itself, there will be those who want everyone to follow the same human-based cultural ideals and values, even if they don't come from God. They'll try to get us to believe that no, we don't need God. There is no higher authority than the human intellect and the human will. So basically we can worship ourselves, as Nebuchadnezzar was trying to redo with the Tower of Babel in our passage. We need to remember that that's what the Tower of Babel stood for. The desire of humanity to replace God with the worship of its own ability. It's so tempting for our human ego to fall for those traps. And on a personal level, we see that in the power play of those Babylonian officials to try and get rid of Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego in our passage. And that can show up in how we might be tempted to cling to any scraps of authority or influence or prestige or social position that we can manage to accumulate. Whether it's at our jobs, our homes, volunteer activities, anything else in life. Do we find ourselves trying to hold on to them for our own sake, for our own self-worth, or do we truly put our trust ultimately in God alone? And this brings us back to how we understand and use power. In psychology, that Psychology Today article by Dr. Rick Hansen that I mentioned earlier, he also wrote this. He said, "Woven through the tapestry of our relationships are several major threads, and one of those is power, which plays out in almost every group of any size. The only question is, do we use it for good or ill? Like a hammer, power itself is neutral. It can be used justly and wisely for beneficial purposes, such as the necessary authority of a loving parent, a child's popular friend protecting her from mean kids, a physically stronger spouse helping a more vulnerable one, or a government defending a country that's being invaded. Power can be used unjustly and unwisely for harmful purposes, such as a parent beating a child, or a big kid picking on a little one, or domestic violence, or a government jailing critics. Power is neutral. It can be used for good or for ill. As Christians, we need to be very mindful about how we use whatever power or influence we may have. In a group, it might be tempting to want to assert our will for our own sake, to make us feel like we are in control. Don't see that as much today, but we don't have to think very far back to a time when that was probably the case. Like other people, or we may tell ourselves that this is really to honor God, but that can easily backfire, actually. In fact, when studies were done about why many Generation X had left the church, the number one reason they gave was because they saw Christian organizations trying to become too political and trying to exert power in that arena rather than focusing on trying to follow Jesus and follow his example and how we treat others. And it remains as one of the reasons why Christians have been distrusting the institution of church, very sensitive to ways in which the church might be more self-serving than following the mission of Jesus. This is something we have to be very, very careful about these days. And even on an individual level, on a personal level, this is a challenge for us as well. How do we use our own personal influence, our own personal resources, our own personal power in that sense? Do we first of all try to use them for our own benefit, or are we looking to honor God with it? Do we try to gain status, wealth, influence, how it will benefit us? How God can use them for his kingdom? Do we look at how we can act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with our God, as we looked at a couple months ago? Idolatry can take many, many forms today. And so a question is there anything that we're putting before God in our life? And especially, do we try to put any human, and especially ourselves, in his place? The more we're willing to look into that personally, the more convicting it can become. The more successful we become personally, the greater the challenge will be. For me, it's one of the reasons I find it so important to follow the third of the Ten Commandments and begin each week with worship. With worship of the one true God, refocusing on the truth of who he is and who I am in comparison, and how much I need him. How incredibly gracious he has been to me, in spite of what I've done. He is the perfect example for us too in all of this. Think of what Jesus gave up. Gave up the glory and the power of heaven and came down to a dusty backroads village in Palestine to become one of us. And after we had rejected him, he was willing to give up his own life for us, even though we still failed to see how much we needed him. You know, like Shadrach, Meshack, and Abednego, I guess we too can take comfort in that same promise, though, of God's presence with us as we face the challenges to our faith in life. Since this same God is really our only hope, whether it's in the fires of our daily trials or in the face of the ultimate eternal fire, our only comfort in life and in death is that we belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to our faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, and not a hair can fall from our heads without his will. He is and will be through us all, even to the very end of this age.